Lately, a lot of people have been criticizing my content when it comes to anything related to editorials, saying that the majority of time that I spend when I talk about BSG and the player base, if I end up having something to rant on, it tends to typically be in BSG's favor, trying to lend an air of understanding to whatever it is that BSG is going through and hopefully attempting to help educate the player base in terms of what should be expected and what BSG's intentions are. However, there is an awful lot wrong with Escape from Tarkov. First on our list, audio. Tarkov's audio is scuffed. It's wrong. There's so much wrong with it, I couldn't even list off the number of things in this 8 to 10 minute video in terms of what is wrong with it as a whole. There are bugs in terms of sound localization, things come from the wrong direction, you can't tell if things are above or below you in the vast majority of circumstances, stairways are completely useless, grenades still go off silently, as do certain gunshots, even from loud weapons, depending on where they're fired from. About a year ago, I made a Little Things video that talked about sound and how falling doesn't end up making noise. In the vast majority of circumstances, this bug has been around for multiple years, and even now, if you walk off of a ledge in a building, any building, when you hit the ground, it doesn't make any noise. Not from a third-party perspective. All of the sound that you hear coming out of your PMC is for you and you alone, unless you jump first. Now, it goes without saying that these bugs need to be fixed. The problem is that all of this audio is based on a threshold level system where you have to pass certain planes in order for the audio to change from like inside to outside or upstairs to downstairs. And depending on where your character's head is determines what kind of audio levels you end up hearing. With all of these planar thresholds kind of being the trigger points in terms of how the audio changes and it not being a graduated system, what it really needs to become, this will persist. Now, the devs have said that they know that this is a problem and they need to do an overhaul of the audio system, but that is going to be a major undertaking. So again, this is one of those things that's just going to take time, and unfortunately, we're left to deal with the frustration. Now, the word frustration is probably going to be very, very common thematically throughout this, so sorry. Second on our list is the loot system, especially now that they're working on dynamic loot. The loot points associated with things like high-value keys are garbage. Most of the loot points where there is loosely placed loot, where keys at one time had been extremely expensive because of their rarity and the value of loot that was behind them, are trash. There's nothing around. When you open up locked rooms on places like labs or the high loot areas in interchange, there's almost never a good piece of loot to be found inside of them. Instead, we're left to have to roam maps like nomads looking for loot spread throughout the maps. And Nikita assures us that the loot value of each map is exactly the same, if not more, now that the loot systems have been buffed on all of the maps globally. Yet, an overwhelming majority of the time, people are not finding those highly valued items, having to loot smaller, lesser valued things like nuts and bolts instead of GPUs, and no one in the late game phases wants to have to deal with that. If BSG wants to improve this, they need to increase the value of loot that is to be found behind these locked doors. But again, that is based on whether or not this is something that BSG wants to do. The other issue with this is that there becomes a lack of focal points, and for people wanting to engage in PvP fights and find those interactions where they can get those hot and sweaty raids where lots of people are shooting at each other like you see in the cinematics, that right now doesn't happen. At least not as often as what it was before the loot dynamics system. It feels as though in order for loot to really be viable for the vast majority of the player base, the loot itself needs to be even more abundant than it is already, or at least have a higher base value associated with it than what it is already. Or there needs to be some much more involved and more accurately made loot maps from the community in order to better help people find what it is that they're looking for. I think in this regard, the best way to, repair this would be to give a little bit better of a loot buff to the locked rooms that have really rare keys. There doesn't really seem to be a need to have any of the rare keys to begin with. The keys become a completely arbitrary thing, aside from looting, containers inside of these rooms. and kind of goes back to the earliest days of Tarkov, which, for a lot of people, wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. The early days boys would probably argue that's a preferential way to play it. This one in particular I'm going to chalk up to personal preference. There are gamers among us that prefer to roam maps as a whole and look for loot everywhere. To them, this has been a boon because they're already doing that and they're finding valuable stuff in lesser traveled areas where the loot is more abundant than what it ever was. To others, this is something that is detrimental because they're used to going to very specific places for very specific things, and those things aren't there as much anymore. For this one, it's going to come down to design intention. If the intention of the game is to do this, then that's the way it's going to go. Unfortunately, the constructive criticism here can't really be that constructive because it comes down to that personal preference aspect of this, and when the player base itself is more or less divided right down the middle in terms of what people like and what they don't, it just comes down to the devs deciding, well, this is the way we're going to do things. Personally, I don't really care. I'm just trying to criticize the things that people don't like. Next, we have the graphics engine. It's a horribly unoptimized potato. Really major issues with frame rates across the board, and Nikita has gone on record saying that if you want to enjoy Tarkov at its fullest, you really need a state-of-the-art machine in order to be able to pull it off. That automatically truncates the player base into something where a lot of people can't be Tarkov enjoyers because they're unable to play the game at a respectable rate of FPS. On maps like Reserve and now the Woods expansion, there is an overwhelming amount of graphical draw that has been horribly optimized, and even computers that have brand new processors and 3080 Ti's, 3090s are unable to run the map at anything higher than 60 to 70 FPS. At the same time, there are major graphical bugs depending on where you stand. There are culling issues where you can see through walls, and you end up taking shots at people hiding behind barriers that end up rendering invisible at range, if only then to discover the reason why they're not dying is because there's a barrier in the way. There are multiple, maybe even hundreds of instances, even now in the current live version of this beta test, and yeah, it is a beta test, go figure, where people are able to see through barriers and stuff is culling at points it shouldn't be, or if your head is set in a perfect position on the corner of a wall, you're able to see through a whole bunch of geometry, and the list, unfortunately, goes on and on and on with this. This is one of those things where things that continuously get reported eventually end up getting fixed. Hopefully, that ends up being a thing that BSG deals with in rather short order, but I have a feeling that these will be persisting for a very long time. Next, we have the AI system. Scavs are a huge pain in the ass. At some points in time, they're complete laser beams. They'll take a 153 on a dead walk, hell, even a sprint, and end up two-tapping you in the chest, two-tapping you in the legs, two-tapping you in the face, almost never missing. A scav with a Taz at 50 meters ends up hitting you head-eyes and ends your run almost instantly. You'll run into Sanitar's guards at the villas as you're walking down the hill from Resort, and they will start shooting you through trees and end your run before you ever even knew that anyone or anything was there. There are karma bugs associated with raiders that persist to this day, where if someone ends up having max rep and kills a raider, they will still, even now after the bug has been reported to have been fixed on multiple different dates, still will end up costing somebody 6 full points of rep as if they were a boss guard. It still happens even now. And then as a player scav, you have super buggy boss AI to begin with. Players that have like 2.0 rep or less end up walking straight up to Killa and slapping him in the face and calling him stupid, and Killa does nothing. Then there are other times when you're walking through the middle of the mall and he turns a corner and he instantly taps you in the face, leaving you confused as to whether or not he's supposed to be your friend. And this is true for player scav boss instances in a lot of different maps, especially when it comes to Woods, where Sturman seems to hone in on player scavs as if they were PMCs regardless of whatever rep they had, as long as it's below max. And then of course there's the netcode. I made that video forever ago about ping abuse, and now ping abuse seems to be a household name in the land of Tarkov, which I unfortunately deeply regret and wish I had never done, but I digress. People still take advantage of things like travel time, round-trip time for ping in order to be able to get that netcode jump on people because the game is client-side authoritative. There's a major netcode problem with Escape from Tarkov. Probably the biggest issue that exists in Tarkov right now is the desync and netcode exploitation that is capable of being done, especially if you have people that use things like lag switches, which then gets you into hackers and ESP users and the rampant usage of cheats that go either undetected or slowly detected and even more slowly reacted to. At least that's what it feels like. The problem is that the lines start to get blurred between what is actually cheating and what is just really poor netcode when it comes to desync problems. The only way to truly fix this is to make the game server authoritative. In order to make the game server authoritative the way that it should be, they need to have a lot more servers. That also means that there would have to be ping restrictions that are more stringent than what they are right now, which they used to be, but then there are players in places like South Africa that don't have the ability to play anywhere because the ping restrictions don't allow them to play on servers at all. If they made the servers fully authoritative to where the client isn't able to dictate positioning and hit registration and whatnot by reporting to the server and the server verifying it, that would mean that the ping restrictiveness of the servers would have to be severely increased. So instead of 170 ping, it would have to be a max of like something closer to 100, maybe even less than that. That also means that people wouldn't be able to play with their friends, but you would have less complaints about whether or not people felt like they were getting netcoded. But the reality of it is even though that the netcode in the game is the best that it's ever been, and I've said this before, the best that it's ever been doesn't mean that it's good. And finally, this is probably the biggest one, is the lack of transparency. And I'll give you guys the inside info on this. BSG doesn't want us data mining the game. No Food After Midnight's ammo chart is like the only piece of real information that we have in terms of ballistic information that was data mined from the game that the devs allowed. And I think at this point, the devs wish that they hadn't allowed it at all. Because once the player base starts learning about statistics, obviously they start working on min-maxing the way that the game is played. But the data mining of the game goes into more than that. Things like boss spawn rates and loot spawn rates, and when variables get modified, or something like a pellet dispersion mechanic that is built in as a variable in shotgun barrels, or misfire rates per piece of ammunition types, and guns, and dust covers, and magazines, and how all those different capacity mags and stuff all have their own variables associated with misfire chance. And how on the data mining side, guys like me and others like me, like Logical Solutions, have the ability to see all of that information. But we are told by the devs not to share that information because it's not something that the devs want you guys to know about. And then we end up in this weird middle ground position where we want to be transparent with the community and help other people understand how these mechanics work better as educators. And then at the same time, we're trying to honor the wishes of BSG because, quite frankly, we were told that if we shared certain aspects of information with the community, and this includes the wiki, that BSG would encrypt all of the data so that no one would be able to use it, including the guys in the wiki, which means all of the data transparency would get shut down and no one would know anything else about the game anymore. At least not on the internal, like, quote-unquote, secretive data mineable side. Most of the cool updated info that I provide you guys, or have been able to provide you guys in the past, has come in part from a lot of data mining of the game when variables change from patch to patch. But there are things that I see constantly that I am unable to share with you guys for fear that I would be the cause as to why BSG ends up shutting this stuff down. My criticism in this is that I believe that it should be more transparent and that everyone should know more about this. And BSG, as a company, whatever, should be giving us more updates in terms of where they're going, where they've been, what they're going to be doing, etc., etc., etc. It would be nice. Comparatively speaking, at this current point in time, it is better than it has ever been, kind of like the netcode, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. Unfortunately, in this regard, transparency also only goes so far, because the next major criticism, and really the last one that I have in this case, is that BSG has never made a target date on anything that they have ever said any further in the future than like 2 weeks. There are posts from sales, like the one that took place in late 2017 when I ended up purchasing Escape from Tarkov and started playing it in early 2018 after Christmas, where they were going to be releasing Streets in Q1 of 2018. That was what was advertised. Streets of Tarkov, Q1 of 2018. There was a Gamescom conference back in 2016 when Nikita said that Tarkov was going to go live out of beta at some point in 2017, early 2017. We are now in 2021, and the game is still, at least in my opinion, a year away from being released in terms of 1.0. They have been late on every major milestone patch for content that they have ever set out to release. Most recently was the first mention of Lighthouse being put out at the end of summer back in May of this year before they ended up doing a wipe. To which I said there's no possible way. They just started gray boxing this thing. It's being approved just as like a general layout thing in May. There's no way that they're making the end of September. And if I was going to be the marketing guru at BSG, I would be saying we release the Lighthouse expansion with a Christmas sale and have the Christmas event all rolled up into one, and everybody gets VoIP and inertia and all this other stuff as one big major Christmas content update patch, including Unity 2019, and they wipe the game again when they introduce Lighthouse, and that's probably going to be how it works. The problem is that BSG has never even been within like a 3-month marker of whenever it was that they said that they were going to release a major piece of content if it was looking forward any more than like a month. They have never, ever, ever been good at this. They've never hit a target date, never hit a future target date, because they're slow. They're slow. It takes them forever to release content. It takes them forever to update the game. It takes them forever to patch and fix and do all of the things that they say that they need to do. And whenever they end up making a target date, you always end up pushing it out at least double the length of time that they say that they're going to take. Unless, of course, they say that the patch is going to be next week. I mean, right now they're like probably 70%-ish accuracy rate on that. And even for all of this, we still play the game. I still love the game. Everybody loves the game. For all of its flaws, people still go in and they play the damn game. My point in making this and talking about the things that it's going to take to be able to fix this stuff and the things that they should do to change things and whatever it is that they need to come up with is there is more than just saying this thing stinks. Like, gun jams are really, really annoying. But Tarkov from day one has always said there's going to be gun malfunctions in the game. We're going to introduce gun malfunctions. Gun malfunctions are coming. And you have guys that are used to playing a certain way that just don't like stuff. Because that will not happen. That will not happen. And if you expect the devs to deal with the constructive aspect of your criticism, take it into heart, and try to make adjustments while making that mechanic or whatever it is that you're criticizing work, you have to be able to give them a little bit of adaptation yourself. So there's like, 12 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever it was, of what is wrong with Escape from Tarkov. And now that wasn't even close to everything. There's a lot more. There are major issues. I hope the devs are working on it. I hope the game doesn't die. But I don't think it's going anywhere, dude. I really don't. I think Tarkov is going to be just fine. And I think that if half the player base were to leave tomorrow, the devs would also be just fine with that too. Because this has already exceeded their expectations much more than they ever thought it would. And I personally got my money's worth. So, screw it. All right. That's what I got. Thanks for coming and checking me out, boys. I'll see you soon. Peace.